The ghost town of Bitter Creek had been abandoned for over a year, its silver mines played out and its dreams buried beneath the unforgiving New Mexico sun. But on this blazing afternoon in 1885, the empty buildings would witness an encounter that challenged everything the territory believed about justice, family loyalty, and the price of redemption. Running Bear had been tracking the Dalton gang for 8 days, following their trail of robbery and murder across 3 counties. At 26, he was the youngest war chief in his Apache band's history, chosen not just for his skill with weapons, but for his ability to see patterns that others missed, to understand the criminal mind and predict where desperate men would run when the law closed in around them. The gang had hit the bank in Socorro 6 days ago, killing 2 civilians and a deputy in their escape. They'd left behind enough evidence to hang them all twice over, but they'd also vanished into the desert like smoke in the wind. Every posse and bounty hunter in the territory was searching for them, following false trails and chasing shadows while the real killers planned their next move. But Running Bear knew something the others didn't. He knew where desperate men with stolen gold would go to ground. Bitter Creek offered everything outlaws needed: abandoned buildings for shelter, a well that still held water, and most importantly, complete isolation from the law. It was the perfect hideout for men who needed to wait for the heat to die down before making their run to Mexico. What Running Bear hadn't expected was what he found chained to a post outside the old saloon. As he crested the ridge overlooking the ghost town, Running Bear's sharp eyes immediately picked out the signs of recent habitation: smoke stains on chimneys that should have been cold, fresh horse tracks in the dust, and the glint of sunlight off metal that didn't belong in an abandoned settlement. But it was the figure by the saloon that made him reach for his rifle. A young woman sat chained to a wooden post, her wrists bound with iron shackles that had rubbed her skin raw and bloody. Her dress had once been fine, the kind worn by a respectable town girl, but now it was torn and stained with dust and dried blood. Her dark hair hung loose around a face that bore the bruises of recent violence, but her green eyes blazed with an unbroken spirit that reminded Running Bear of captured eagles who never stopped fighting for freedom. She looked up as his shadow fell across her, and instead of fear, he saw recognition flash in her eyes, not of him personally, but of what he represented: Apache warrior. The enemy her people had taught her to fear above all others, but when she spoke, her words carried hope rather than terror. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from thirst and calling for help that never came. "I know what you must think of me, but I'm not here by choice. They took me 3 days ago. They're planning something terrible." Running Bear dismounted and approached carefully, his eyes scanning the empty buildings for signs of ambush. "Who took you?" he asked in careful English. "The Dalton gang," she replied, then added with bitter emphasis, "My own father's been hunting them for months. They grabbed me from our ranch to use as insurance. Said if the law got too close, they'd trade my life for safe passage to Mexico." The irony wasn't lost on Running Bear. Sheriff Tom Crawford was legendary throughout the territory for his relentless pursuit of outlaws and his particular hatred of Apache raiders. The man had sworn to see every hostile Indian hanging from a tree, and he'd made good on that promise more times than Running Bear cared to count. Apache mothers used Crawford's name to frighten children into obedience, and now Crawford's daughter sat chained like an animal, begging for mercy from one of the very people her father hunted. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. "What's your name?" Running Bear asked as he examined the heavy chains that bound her to the post. "Mary Crawford," she replied, then added with a strange mixture of shame and defiance, "But that's not the whole truth. My real name is Maria Luz Crawford. My mother was Apache, from the Mescalero band near Ruidoso. She died when I was 7, and my father, he spent the last 15 years trying to pretend that part of me doesn't exist." Running Bear's hands stilled on the chains as the full implications hit him. Sheriff Crawford, the great Indian hunter, had married an Apache woman. The man who'd built his reputation on killing savages had a daughter who carried Apache blood in her veins. He never told anyone, Mary continued, her voice gaining strength as she finally spoke truths she'd been forced to hide her entire life. Made me promise to never mention my mother's people, never speak Apache, never acknowledge that half of who I am. Said it would ruin his career if people knew. Running Bear looked into her green eyes, eyes that now reminded him of his own sisters, and saw not just another white settler's daughter, but a woman caught between worlds, forced to deny half her heritage to survive in the other half. And that's when everything changed forever. The sound of approaching horses shattered the afternoon quiet, echoing off the empty buildings like gunshots. Running Bear's head snapped up as he counted the rhythm, 3 riders moving at a steady pace that suggested confidence rather than haste. The Dalton gang, returning to their hideout after scouting for pursuit or perhaps planning their next crime. "Hide," Mary whispered urgently. "They'll kill you if they find you here, and they'll kill me for talking to you." But Running Bear was already moving, not to hide, but to position himself for the coming confrontation. He'd tracked these men too far and too long to let them escape now, especially not with an innocent woman as their captive. More than that, Mary Crawford's revelation had changed everything. She wasn't just another hostage, but a woman with Apache blood being brutalized by the very criminals her white father was sworn to stop. The first shot came from Frank Dalton as soon as he spotted the Apache warrior near their prisoner. The bullet whined past Running Bear's ear and shattered wood from the saloon's facade, but by then the warrior was already moving, using the abandoned building's cover with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to fight in terrain that offered no mercy to the slow or careless. The battle that followed was swift and decisive. Running Bear's intimate knowledge of guerrilla warfare, combined with his righteous fury at what had been done to Mary, made him a force of nature that the outlaws were completely unprepared to face. Within minutes, 2 of the Daltons lay dead in the dust, and the third, the leader, Jake Dalton, found himself staring down the barrel of an Apache rifle with nowhere left to run. "Please," Jake begged, his hands raised in surrender. "I got money, lots of it. We can make a deal." "The only deal you'll get is a quick death instead of a slow one," Running Bear replied coldly. "Unless you tell me why you took the woman." Jake's eyes darted toward Mary, then back to the rifle pointed at his chest. "Insurance, like I told her. Her daddy's been dogging our trail for weeks. We figured if we had his daughter, he'd back off long enough for us to get across the border." "And then?" Jake's silence was answer enough. Running Bear's finger tightened on the trigger, but Mary's voice stopped him. "Wait," she called out. "Don't kill him." "Not yet, but you haven't seen the biggest surprise yet." As Running Bear kept Jake covered, Mary struggled to her feet despite the chains that bound her. Her green eyes blazed with an anger that seemed to burn from somewhere deep in her Apache soul, the part of herself she'd been forced to deny for so many years. "You want to know why my father's been hunting you so hard?" she asked Jake, her voice carrying a strength that seemed to grow with each word. "It's not just because you robbed his bank or killed his deputy. It's because you represent everything he's tried to run away from his whole life." She turned to Running Bear, and when she spoke again, it was in fluent Apache, words that flowed like water from someone who had never truly forgotten her mother's language, despite years of being forbidden to speak it. "My father married my mother during the worst of the Apache wars," she said, switching back to English so Jake could understand. "She saved his life when he was wounded and lost in the desert. They fell in love. But when the army found out he'd married an Apache woman, they threatened to court-martial him for fraternizing with the enemy." Running Bear listened with growing amazement as Mary continued her story, each word revealing new layers of deception and self-hatred that had shaped her entire life. "So he made a choice," Mary said, her voice bitter with old pain. "He publicly divorced my mother and sent her back to the reservation, then remarried a white woman to save his career. But he kept me, because I looked white enough to pass. My mother died of a broken heart within a year." The truth hit Running Bear like a physical blow. Sheriff Crawford wasn't just a typical Indian fighter. He was a man consumed by guilt and self-loathing, trying to atone for his betrayal of white society by becoming the territory's most ruthless Apache hunter. He's been trying to kill the Apache part of himself By killing as many of my mother's people as possible, Mary continued. Every raid he leads, every warrior he hangs, it's his way of proving to the world that he's not the man who loved an Apache woman. Wait, don't miss this crucial detail. As Mary spoke, Running Bear began working on her chains with tools from his belt, but his mind was reeling from her revelations. This changed everything he thought he knew about Sheriff Crawford and the brutal campaigns that had decimated so many Apache families. There's something else, Mary said quietly, as the shackles finally fell away from her wrists. My father keeps records, detailed accounts of every Apache camp he's raided, every family he's destroyed. But he also keeps something else hidden in his safe. Letters from my mother's family, asking about me, wanting to know if I'm still alive. Running Bear's hands stilled. Your mother's family? They're still alive? Mary nodded, tears streaming down her face. My grandmother, my uncle, 2 cousins. They've been trying to find me for years, but my father told them I was dead. He said it was better that way. Better for me to grow up white than to be torn between 2 worlds. The sound of approaching riders interrupted their conversation. Multiple horses this time, moving fast and kicking up a dust cloud visible for miles. Running Bear grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, his heart sinking as he recognized the blue uniforms and military precision of a cavalry patrol. Your father? He asked. Mary joined him at the window, her face pale as she recognized the lead rider. Yes, and he's brought a full company with him. Running Bear faced an impossible choice. He could try to escape, leaving Mary to explain her rescue to a father who would never believe she'd been saved by an Apache. Or he could stay and face certain death or capture, knowing that Mary's mixed heritage would offer him no protection once Crawford realized who had freed his daughter. What you're seeing now is nothing compared to what happens next. But Mary Crawford had spent her entire life caught between 2 worlds, and she was done letting other people make choices about her future. I'm going with you, she said firmly, reaching for Jake Dalton's dropped gun belt. I'm done pretending to be something I'm not. I'm done letting my father's shame define my life. Running Bear stared at her. You understand what that means? If you ride out of here with me, there's no going back. Your father will declare you dead rather than admit his daughter chose to live with Apache people. Mary's smile was fierce and beautiful, like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Then maybe it's time Sheriff Tom Crawford learned that his daughter inherited more from her Apache mother than just green eyes. As the cavalry patrol thundered into Bitter Creek, they found nothing but dead outlaws and an empty chain where Mary Crawford should have been. The official report stated that Miss Crawford had been killed by the Apache warrior who'd attacked the gang's hideout, her body presumably taken as a trophy. Sheriff Crawford never stopped searching for his daughter's remains, but he never found them. How could he, when Mary had finally found her way home to her mother's people, where she was welcomed not as a white man's daughter, but as one of their own blood, returned at last to where she belonged? Running Bear and Mary built a life together that bridged both their worlds, his knowledge of Apache warfare and survival, her understanding of white society and its weaknesses. Together, they became legendary figures who protected Apache families from cavalry raids while helping peaceful Apache people find safe passage to Mexico when the reservation system made life impossible. Mary never saw her father again, but years later, stories reached them that Sheriff Crawford had changed. The man who once hunted Apache warriors with ruthless efficiency had become strangely reluctant to pursue raids into Apache territory. Some said he'd grown soft with age. Others whispered that he'd seen ghosts in the desert, the spirit of his lost daughter riding alongside Apache warriors, reminding him of the choices he'd made and the love he'd thrown away. The truth was simpler and more complex. Tom Crawford had finally realized that the Apache blood he'd tried so hard to deny in his daughter was the same blood that had given her the strength to survive captivity, the courage to choose her own path, and the wisdom to forgive even those who tried to erase half of who she was. The woman who'd been chained as a prisoner became a bridge between worlds, and the warrior who'd risked everything to free her learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from helping someone discover the courage to claim their true identity. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that identity is not something to be ashamed of, but something to be claimed with pride, then you found your home. Subscribe to Wild West Romance Stories for more tales of courage, transformation, and love that transcends every boundary society tries to build. From ghost town rescues to family revelations, every story we tell proves that the strongest bonds are forged not in denial of who we are, but in the brave acceptance of our complete selves. This is where two worlds meet and discover that love grows strongest when it honors every part of who we truly are.